Okay, so first action, I want to Korean wave dash in on the enemy. Second action, do a low sweep. And third action, follow up with an electric wind god fist. How many times do I have to tell you you're playing Pathfinder, not Tekken? You're just jealous because I'm ready for the next battle. Today, we're going to talk about the Monk class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller whose motto is, strike first, strike hard, no mercy. Oh, you know you're getting a lot of Karate Kid jokes in this episode. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are returning to my classic introduction series where we take an introductory look at different classes in RPGs, specifically Pathfinder 2e at the moment, and examine what those classes have to offer players who are interested in that type of character. Right now, I am working on finishing out all of the core rulebook classes for Pathfinder 2e by the end of the year, and one of the final classes that I need to cover is the Monk. It is a class that focuses on unarmored and often unarmed combat, featuring flashy moves and an array of interesting options. If you are looking for a class where you can really dive in deep and get a variety of different combat styles for your character, Monk is a class that I think is worth looking at, and today we're going to be diving into that class. Now this video is not going to cover everything in the Monk class, but it is going to be an introductory overview of the things you can expect if you would like to play a Monk. To that effect, we'll be examining the Monk class through the lens of 5 specific questions. What is the Monk class? What are the strengths of the Monk? What are the weaknesses of the Monk? What are some of the character build options that I have for the Monk? And how can I get the most out of the Monk in play? So join me for the conversation. And as always, don't forget to do that YouTube stuff. Like the video, share the video, and definitely dive down into the comments section and offer your thoughts, your insights into this interesting class from Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Also, you can join my free Discord group by following the link in the video description, and if you are interested in supporting this channel financially, you can find my Patreon link in the video description as well. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so the first question that we need to answer today is, what is the Monk class? Now the Monk class is found in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, so it is one of the base options for the game. The Monk class kind of fills that role of the martial artist, the unarmed fighter that we see in a lot of movies and a lot of action-adventure style stories. And I do think that the Monk carves out a fun and unique space inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but let's be a little more technical in our discussion of what the Monk class is. When we talk about the question, what is any class in Pathfinder 2e, I typically break it down into 3 subcategories. First up, what is the role of the class? Second up, how complex is the class? And finally, what are the key terms or concepts that you want to be aware of if you decide to play a character from that class? Now the first part of that is pretty easy. The class role for the Monk is very much a martial class, and it follows kind of the model that you expect from other martial classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So when you talk about the Monk, you are naturally going to be comparing it to classes such as the Fighter, the Barbarian, the Rogue, or the Swashbuckler. The Monk thrives in combat. It's good at getting into a fight, and it's good at deploying a wide variety of interesting attacks and abilities inside of the fight in order to bring down its foes. The Monk very clearly falls under that martial class distinction, but I do think it is important to note that the monk is very much geared towards melee martial combat. There are some ranged combat options for the monk. The monk is not devoid of the ability to engage with an enemy at a distance, but by and large, most of the tools that you find for the monk class are going to focus on being up close and personal with an enemy, and even a monk that comes with certain ranged options is still going to have an array of tools for when things get up close and personal. The monk also focuses on unarmored and typically unarmed combat, though there are certain weapon-focused monk builds that you can use. So in general, the class role of the monk is a martial character with a strong tendency towards melee combat, unarmored combat, and frequently unarmed combat. So, how complex is the monk? Well, I'm going to admit I am a little bit conflicted here, because the monk definitely has some complexity, but I feel like most of that complexity is packed in the early portions of a monk build, and once you kind of get over that initial hurdle for the monk, then I think the monk gets a lot easier to play. So I'm going to give the monk a complexity rating of 6 to 7, and I'm going to say that most of that complexity is front-loaded when it comes to the class. And when we get into the build options and, oh my, all of the stances, I think you'll understand what I'm saying. There is a very important note that I would like to give, and that is, never let a complexity rating scare you off from a particular class. Over many years of gameplay, I have learned that player excitement far outweighs any complexity issue in terms of a class that a character decides to play, and I have seen brand new players pick up very complex classes and do well with them because they were excited for the character. So yes, the monk does have a little bit of homework up front, and you're going to have to think through some complex options when you first look at the monk, but if you're excited to dive into that kind of martial arts oriented combat style, I think that you will find a lot to love, and I think you will appreciate the diverse array of options that Paizo has given this particular class. But it is fair to say that the monk is a little more complex than normal, and you do want to be on the lookout for some of that complexity. And while a lot of that complexity goes into some of your initial build of the monk, it doesn't just stay there. As we move into the last part of this discussion, key terms, monk is a class that's going to come with several different key terms, and some of these key terms are a little bit different from what you find with other martial classes, and it can be a little more difficult to keep up with. For example, one of the key terms that you will find with a lot of monk abilities is the term flourish. And flourish is basically a term that means once per round. You can only use an action with the flourish trait once in any given round, and if you have multiple actions with the flourish trait, you can only use one of them in a given round. All of the others would be off the table after you use that first one. And monks start the game with an ability called Flurry of Blows, which is a special activity that allows them to spend one action to make 2 attacks. Flurry of Blows is one of the main features for the monk class, and it's pretty powerful. If you combine those 2 attacks against the same creature, you can actually combine the damage before applying any resistances. So Flurry of Blows is an ability that a monk is going to use a lot, and it comes with the Flourish trait. And while they're not super common, there are other monk abilities that also come with the Flourish trait. For example, a lot of the feats that build off of your monk stances will give you access to special actions that come with the Flourish trait as well. A good example of this is the Gorilla Pound special attack that's found in the Advanced Player's Guide. Because Flurry of Blows and Gorilla Pound both have the Flourish trait, you can only use one of them in a given round, and using one will preclude the other. As a monk, you kind of have to keep track of stuff like that. Another trait that you have to keep track of is incapacitation. Now, incapacitation is thankfully reasonably rare, so it's not something that you're going to have to track too often, but incapacitation is often associated with effects or abilities that have the potential to one-hit KO or otherwise remove opponents from a fight. And basically what incapacitation means is that when you use that ability against a creature that is higher level than you, you treat your attack as one step worse, or it treats its saving throw as one step better. Basically, these are attacks that are much less useful against higher level targets, and they're the kinds of abilities that you don't want to pull out against boss creatures because they're not going to be as effective. Monks also have the option to access what are known as key spells. Now, not all monks will have key spells. You'll need to take certain monk feats such as Key Rush or Key Strike if you want to gain access to key spells. But if you select key spells, essentially they are focus spells. And Monk is one of the few martial classes in the game that has access to focus spells as a regular option. Typically, focus spells are associated with spellcasting classes, but Monk, along with Ranger, is one of the few martial classes in the game that can unlock certain magical abilities through the use of focus spells. I don't want to go into all of the rules for focus spells here, but if you are interested in some of the key spells that monks can potentially use, you will want to check out the full rules for focus spells on page 300 of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. But if you're not interested in the more magical abilities, that's a section of the rules that you can kind of gloss over. One last thing to consider, if you do choose to take key spells, you have a decision to make, which is you get to decide if your key spells count as divine magic or occult magic, and it will determine some of the trainings and DCs that you get to use inside of the game. The last official term that Paizo gives us for the monk class that we really want to pay attention to is stance. And basically, a stance action is a special action that you can use only in encounter mode to drop into a particular style of combat, and while you are in that stance, you will have certain restrictions to what you can do and how you can act, but you will also gain certain benefits that apply to your character while you remain in that stance. Stances typically require one action to enter, and you remain in that stance until one of three things happens. Either you break the requirements for the stance, or combat ends, or you use another stance action to switch to a new stance, although it is worth noting you cannot use two stance actions in the same turn. And allow me to say, a lot of the complexity of the monk class is baked into stances. There are other classes in the game that have stances, but monks really take the idea of stances and run with them. Most monks are probably going to have one, maybe two stances that they can use, and there are just a ton of options that are hidden behind these different stance choices that you can make. Now, that ends the list of official terminology that Paizo informs you should pay attention to if you're playing a monk. But as you can probably guess if you've watched more than one episode of this series, Paizo has a bad habit of not calling everything to your attention, and with the monk that is true, there are other considerations that you want to be aware of. First up is the Powerful Fist ability. Powerful Fist changes the damage dice of a monk's fist attack from a D4 to a D6. And while monks continue to have the non-lethal trait for their fist attack, it is worth noting that it is specifically noted monks do not take a -2 penalty when they try to deal lethal damage with a non-lethal weapon. In other words, monks can freely choose to do non-lethal or lethal damage with their unarmed attacks at any time. By the way, for anyone who complains about fighters being better at punching things than monks, if you account for that -2 penalty associated with the non-lethal trait, fighters and monks actually break even when choosing to do lethal damage. So be aware of Powerful Fist because it is an important ability for the monk class. Also, keep this in mind, the monk always has the option to use Powerful Fist. A lot of the monk stances are going to offer you other unarmed attacks that you can use, but as a monk, you can always choose to drop out of a stance and go back to your regular Powerful Fist strikes if that would be more advantageous to you. Never forget that monks have this very useful baseline when it comes to their unarmed attacks, and what they can do in combat. But hey, I'm sure that covers all of the complexity of the monk class, right? Surely they don't have an absurd number of weapon traits that they have to consider like the fighter does. Why, Paizo? Why did you do this to me? So, here is one of the surprise elements that makes Monk a little bit complex. You have to think about weapon traits on a class that is, for the most part, not associated with weapons. Now, we will talk about monastic weaponry a little bit later in this video, because that is one of the options for the monk. But here's the weird thing. Most of the monastic weapons that a monk can potentially use if they follow that line of feats, most of the traits on those weapons aren't too bad. No. The complexity here is the weapon traits on special unarmed attacks from your different stances. Backswing, forceful, sweep, backstabber. That's just 4 quick examples that I pulled from the table inside the core rulebook. Monk stances come with special monk attacks, and those attacks come with special weapon traits that get added to your unarmed strikes. And when you are considering what kind of monk you're going to play and what kind of attacks you use, you have to consider what are these special traits associated with the style of strike that my monk's stance is going to give me. Yeah, it's a lot. When I play a fighter, I expect weapon traits to be something I really have to think about, but the monk class doesn't feel like a class where you're going to have to think too heavily about weapon traits, but because of the way stances and special stance unarmed attacks are written out, weapon traits is something you're going to have to think about as a monk, so just be prepared for that. So those are some of the key terms and ideas that you want to keep in mind if you choose to play a monk. And if you can't tell, yes, there is a lot of upfront complexity here. I actually feel like the ranger and maybe even the fighter are a little bit easier up front as compared to the monk class. With the monk, there's a lot of stuff that you're going to have to think about when you are first building your character. Now the good news is this, once you actually build your monk, it gets a lot easier. You have already laid out what your special attacks are. You already know what your key spell options are going to be. And once you've kind of picked what you've got, it's pretty easy to decide when do I want to use this and when do I want to use that. There is a little bit of an initial hurdle when it comes to building a monk, but once you've built a monk, I do feel like this is a class that plays pretty cleanly, pretty easily, and that most players will have a reasonable time using at the gaming table. But let's move on to the second question in this video, which is, what are the strengths of the monk class? And for the strengths of the monk class, there are 3 things in specific that I would like to discuss. Their defense, their need for speed, and their adaptability. First up, one of the clear-cut strengths of the monk class is they are one of the most defensive-oriented classes in the game. Monks and champions are the only 2 classes that, as of right now, have access to legendary defense by the end of the game. Monks can become legendary with their unarmored proficiency, and that gives them very strong defense relative to a lot of other classes, and on top of that, monks begin the game expert in every single saving throw. Fortitude, reflex, will, monks are good at all of them. And as the monk levels up, they have the unique ability to pick how their saving throws progress, meaning that the monk will get to decide which saves eventually become master and which save eventually becomes legendary for them. All of this means that the monk is an extremely defensive class, and if you enjoy playing a character that is hard to take down, monk is a fantastic option. Another very clear-cut strength for the monk actually kicks in at around level 3, and that is their need for speed. Monks are easily the most maneuverable class in the game that isn't relying on magic of some kind. Monks will get a plus 10 status bonus to their speed, and then as they level up, that status bonus slowly increases, giving monks an incredible base speed. most monks will be able to eventually double their base speed or better, and that means that with the Pathfinder 2e action economy, they can often get to places in a single move action that would take other classes 2 or more stride actions to reach. On top of that, there are a lot of monk class feats and features that allow them to have access to unique ways of moving around their environment. I'm not going to go into all of them in this video, but with access to things like wall run, a monk has the ability to get around their environment a lot easier than other classes. The final strength that I want to emphasize for the monk is adaptability. Now, I already kind of talked about this with the saving throws for the monk, but the monk begins with expert proficiency in every saving throw, and then as they level up, they get to pick, do I want to become a master in fortitude saves or will saves? And then later on down the road, which save do I want to become legendary in? And if you think about this from a metagame perspective, I know a lot of people don't like that terminology, but if you are in a game where your monk is fighting a lot of dragons, then as the campaign goes on, your character might very naturally train up their reflex save to master and then legendary proficiency as they adapt their style to the challenges that they're facing. Monks are an incredibly adaptable class. They have a lot of strong martial potential, but with their incredible speed, with their incredible movement options, they can often imitate a rogue sneaking around the battlefield or moving into flanking positions. They can often use skills like athletics to use different maneuvers against their enemies. Monks are a very adaptable class that have a lot of options inside of the game. And if you remember earlier, we talked about Flurry of Blows, where a monk can spend one action to get 2 attacks. That means that a monk can attack twice and then still have 2 other actions to move into position or respond to whatever the battlefield situations might be. In practical play, the monk is a very adaptable class that can really do kind of whatever it wants on the battlefield. However, before we get into the strengths of the monk, there is one thing that I want to talk about really quick that I think is a trait of the monk class that is going to be a strength or a weakness or both, depending upon your particular perspective, and that is, monks feel like a video game character to me. I'm serious. Of every class in Pathfinder 2e, if there is a class where I feel like I am sitting down and making a video game character, it is the monk. I've heard a lot of accusations that Pathfinder 2e is very video game-like, but frequently with a lot of classes, I still feel the story of the characters I'm making, and usually I don't feel like I'm imitating a video game, but with the monk class, I get that feeling, and I think it's because of how the monk feats work. Here's a special stance, here's a special strike, here's a special spell or super move. I mean, even the focus spells for the monk end up feeling a little bit like meter burn in a fighting game. Monk feels like a video game character very much when you are making one. And sometimes that's a ton of fun. You can really get into the nitty-gritty of how your character fights and what they do, and the advantages that you can bring to the battlefield. It's a lot of fun technical stuff, but it does kind of pull you out of the story a little bit as well. I usually like Pathfinder 2e's character creation. I think it is very story-driven, but on the monk, this is the class I think that has the most video game character feel. So is it a strength? Is it a weakness? It's gonna kind of depend upon your perspective. But let's switch our focus for a little bit, and let's talk about the third question of this video, which is, what are the weaknesses of the monk? And for the first and most important weakness of the monk, I've got to backtrack on one of the things I just said. For strengths, we said that a monk can do just about anything that it wants on the battlefield, and that is mostly true, but as a general rule, monks are typically not very strong when it comes to ranged combat. Now, I'm not going to say that monks have no ranged combat options. They do, and if you're interested in adding some ranged combat options to your monk, I suggest looking at some of the key spell options like Key Blast and Wild Wind's Initiate, or maybe the Shooting Star stance or Monastic Archer stance from the Advanced Player's Guide. Those are some options that you can use to add some ranged abilities to your toolkit, but by and large, the monk class really is focused on melee combat. With your high speed and maneuverability, it's really a class that focuses on getting in on the enemy and engaging them up close and personal. And if a monk finds himself in an extended combat with a foe that is able to stay at ranged, they are probably going to have some trouble. Another weakness of the monk is monks have one of the worst perception progressions in the game. They start trained and do eventually reach expert, but they never go any farther, and depending on the build that you're using for your monk, you may not have very much in the way of wisdom, so it's not hard for the monk to end up with the worst perception score of anybody in their group. The final weakness of the monk, and this is one that we have seen a few times through this series, is MAD, multiple attribute dependency. Monk is a class that is going to need a lot of different attributes in order to be successful. Now, I will say that compared to other fantasy TTRPGs, I feel like Pathfinder has done a good job of focusing the monk in, where it's not as bad as other TTRPGs. Heaven help me, I can't play the D&D 5e monk because they are just so mad that it makes me mad in real life. I do feel like Paizo cleaned up some of that issue, but you have a class that is very arguably going to need good strength, good dex, and good constitution, and if you decide to go into some of the key spells, probably a good wisdom as well. That means a lot of your ability boosts are going to be eaten up on a narrow range of ability scores, and it does kind of limit how a monk can branch out. And I will say monk is arguably the most mad class in Pathfinder 2e. Their multiple attribute dependency is so strong that you actually kind of need to think before you're building your character, what attributes am I going to focus on so that you can make sure that your build is going to be as effective as you want it to be. Monk is a class that can fall into traps if your attribute choices and class choices don't line up well. So with that in mind, let's talk about the fourth question in this video, which is, what are my build options for a monk? And this is where a lot of that early complexity, a lot of that upfront, what do I want to do with this character decision making is going to come in, because monks are like the fighter class in that they don't have defined subclass options in Pathfinder 2e. Fighters and monks are the only two classes in the game where Paizo deliberately doesn't give you subclasses and instead allows your class choices inside of the game to really define what your character is and what they do. Now, unlike the fighter, I feel like the monk is a pretty good class when it comes to flavor in the different options that you have, and so I think it's pretty easy to pick up on the flavor of your character from your class choices very quickly inside of the game, but you still kind of have that problem of when there are no obvious paths to walk, picking what you want to do suddenly becomes a more difficult decision. So let's try to simplify it a bit. Every class in the game comes with a key ability score that gets boosted for free at first level because it is, well, key to what your character is doing, and some classes inside of the game, such as Monk, have the ability to choose between different ability scores. Monks can choose between Strength or Dexterity as their primary ability score in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And I do think that is a handy first distinction to think about when you're deciding what kind of monk do I want to build. Do I want to build a strength-based monk who focuses on heavy hits or grapples or other powerful moves, or do I want to focus on a monk who is more about agility and speed and a flurry of light, swift attacks? Once you've decided which of those two concepts is more appealing to you, then you can go and look at the different monk options and decide, okay, which of these two do I think is the better fit for the character I'm trying to build? Now I will say this, if you decide to do key spells, and especially if you decide to do any key spells that require attack rolls or saving throws, you also want to keep your wisdom in mind for that build, but even if you're using key spells, strength or dexterity is still going to be your primary ability. But let's ask ourselves, which monk options tend to go better for the strength build, and which monk options tend to go better for the dexterity build? Now there are some options that I don't think necessarily lean to strength or dexterity over the other, and a good example of this is the monastic weaponry monk class feat. Monastic weaponry essentially allows you to take monk weapons and use them with flurry of blows and other monk class abilities that you might unlock. And in that case, the question of do I want strength or dexterity for my build is really going to boil down to which kinds of weapons you're interested in using. Weapons with the agile and finesse trait are probably going to go more towards a dexterity build, whereas weapons that don't have those traits are more likely to go with a strength build. Another set of options that I think could go either way are the key spell options that monks have access to. Now I will say this, the key spell monk, a lot of the advice I've seen online recommends if you're going to use key spells, go ahead and do a dexterity-based monk. And for a lot of them, I would say that that is a very valid approach. You may remember earlier that I mentioned some of your key spell options are going to give you ranged attack options, and that is something that would be more in line with a dexterity-based monk. But I don't think that key spell monks have to be dexterity or have to be strength. This is one of those cases where you might want to look at the different spells you're interested in and see if they would fit better with a strength-based monk or a dex-based monk. But really and truthfully, where most of your decision making is going to happen is with the stances that monks are able to use. You may remember earlier that I said that when your monk enters a stance, they often gain access to special unarmed strikes that they are able to use. And that those unarmed strikes come with special weapon traits as a result of the stance that your monk is in. Well, those weapon traits that your unarmed attacks gain are probably going to influence if you would rather be a strength-based monk or a dexterity-based monk. And again here, I think the easiest way to split them is if the stance would give you an unarmed strike that has agile, finesse, or any kind of ranged weapon capability, you probably would prefer dexterity to be your primary attribute, but if it doesn't have one of those three things, you would probably prefer to do a strength-based monk build instead, though again, these are not options that must be followed every single time. By the way, one thing I want to stress really quick in this discussion of monk stances, most monk stances will be followed up by one or two additional feats that kind of build off the base stance and give you unique actions or abilities in addition to the basic stance benefits. I'm not discussing those here because this is an introductory video, but be aware most stances will build beyond the basic abilities of the initial feat that gives you that stance. However, when I look at the different stances that monks can take, it looks like there are 4 stances that lean more towards the strength-based monk build, and 8 stances that lean more towards a dex-based monk build, at least in general use. So let's talk about the strength-based monk builds first. Those would be Dragon Stance, Mountain Stance, Iron Blood Stance, and Gorilla Stance from the Advanced Player's Guide. Dragon Stance is a stance that focuses on very high damage and powerful kicks, and that high damage output naturally matches well with a strength-based monk. The Gorilla Stance from the APG doesn't have quite as much damage as the Dragon Stance, but it also gives you some bonuses with grappling and climbing, and solid damage plus grappling and climbing definitely leans more towards a strength-based monk, in my opinion. Now, Iron Blood Stance is one of 2 defensive stances that you can take inside of the game, and this is a higher level stance option for monks, but basically what it does is give you damage resistance. Now, this doesn't explicitly state that you need a high strength to use, but since some of your defense is coming in the form of damage resistance, you can trade off for a lower dexterity and instead focus on strength to increase your own damage output, and it works pretty well. However, the monk stance that I think is the most clear-cut in which build option you want to go with is definitely the Mountain Stance Monk, and this is a monk stance that actually denies you any dexterity bonus to defense when you first take it. Later levels you can change this a little bit, but your dexterity cap is 0. And instead, the Mountain Stance Monk gains a +4 status bonus to their armor class. That is incredibly powerful. Mountain Stance is easily one of the most defensive stances in the game, and because you have a dexterity cap in that stance, you definitely want to focus on strength instead. Now, when it comes to dexterity-oriented monk stances, there are 8 options that I think tend to lean more toward you would like dexterity to be your primary stat. Now, 2 of them are as obvious as I'll get out, and that is Monastic Archer and the Shooting Star stance. Monastic Archer lets you use a bow with Flurry of Blows, and Shooting Star stance lets you use Shuriken. Both of those are ranged weapons, both of those are dexterity based. It's pretty obvious which way that build is going to go. Now, as for the other stances that I think pair really well with a dexterity-based monk, you have quite a few options. Crane Stance, Tangled Forest Stance, Wolf Stance, Tiger Stance, Stumbling Stance, Peafowl Stance, and Cobra Stance. Crane Stance is intended to be a defensive stance, giving you a circumstance bonus to your AC. Tangled Forest Stance is intended to be a sort of lockdown stance, forcing enemies that are adjacent to you to make skill checks if they want to move away from you. Wolf Stance is sort of a tag team stance that gives you extra bonuses if you manage to get into flanking. Tiger Stance is a stance that allows you to deal bleed damage with your unarmed strikes. Stumbling Stance mimics what is sometimes referred to as drunken boxing, and what I think is the most interesting about Stumbling Stance is if an enemy hits you, they actually become flat-footed against the next strike you make against them. So it sort of turns your enemy's offense against them. Peafowl Stance is actually a weapon stance that blends sword work and footwork and allows you to make bonus steps in tandem with your sword strikes. And then Cobra Stance, which is one of the most interesting options in my book, changes the damage of your unarmed strikes to poison damage. It also comes with the deadly trait, which is kind of fun, but I think it's really fun having a poison strike as a stance option for monks. Now, as I said, none of those stances absolutely require you to use the dexterity-based monk, but because most of those have agile or finesse as the traits of their unarmed strike, they are typically going to pair really well with a dexterity-based monk. But as a general rule, when you're thinking about building a monk character, what you want to do is think about which monk weapons, which monk key spells, or which monk stances are the most interesting to you, and then kind of determine, do I want strength more or do I want dex more? And if you're using key spells, add some wisdom in there. But look at the options you're interested in and see how you should focus your build so that you're getting the most out of those options. But alright, let's move on to our last question. How can I get the most out of a monk in play? There is a lot of complexity in building a monk, but then once you've kind of picked your options, it's usually going to be pretty clear what your best options are in most fight scenes. So what does this translate to for a player who is trying to get the most out of a monk? The first and most important rule when it comes to a monk is choose your weapon, but don't rely on your weapon too much. What do I mean? Well, as I mentioned, there are a variety of key spells. There are a variety of monastic weapons. There are a variety of stances you can choose from. And so, as a monk player, you want to think very carefully, okay, which weapons, quote unquote, am I most interested in? Do I like Tiger Stance and Key Blast? Do I like the Bow Staff and Tangling Forest stance? You want to consider what your weapons are going to be, and you want to deliberately choose a path that is going to match those weapons well, but it is also important to remember you can put those weapons down. You don't have to be in Mountain Stance. You don't have to wield a bow staff every single round of every single combat. As a monk, you can set those options aside when they are not advantageous. Don't forget, you always have that powerful fist baseline that we discussed way back in section 1 that allows just generic unarmed strikes to be very effective for you as a character. Choose your weapon, know how to use your weapon, but also know when that weapon is not serving you well so that you can default to another option or even just your baseline strikes, which will be more advantageous to you. The second tip that I want to talk about is the fact that a monk is a defense-oriented class. You have legendary unarmored defense. You have excellent saving throws that you got to pick for yourself. And so as a monk, part of what you want to do is you want to play for the long game. Think about some of your other advantages. You have excellent speed. You have probably a number of cool movement options that you can access. As a monk, you can decide where you're going to be on the battlefield, what you're doing on the battlefield, and you can make it a point to take and hold advantageous positions and really maneuver the battle into a place that's going to be good for you long term. Flurry of Blows allows you to strike twice for a single action, which means that you can attack twice like most other martial classes in the game and still have 2 actions remaining to find a better spot, move to safety, or do something else that's going to be beneficial to your team. As a monk, don't be afraid to play defense and let your enemies overextend, let your enemies make mistakes, let your enemies work themselves into a situation where they just can't compete with all of the amazing things that you can accomplish. There is one final thing that I would like to talk about when it comes to the monk, and I really didn't know where else to put this, so I'm just going to put it here. And that is, if you choose key spells as an option for your monk, you get to choose divine spellcasting or occult spellcasting as how your focus spells are going to scale. Right now, the way Pathfinder 2nd Edition stands, I strongly recommend choosing the divine option if you are interested in multi-classing. Most monks, if they have a good casting score, it's going to be wisdom. You probably don't have the bumps for intelligence or charisma to really make a very strong multi-class build. Well, right now, there is a wisdom-based divine spellcasting class, the cleric, that you can multi-class with, but there are no wisdom-based occult spellcasting classes at this point in the game. In fact, this is being recorded right about the time that Dark Archive is going to release, and we already know that there are no wisdom-based psychics inside of Dark Archive. I'm actually a little disappointed because I would have liked to see some wisdom-based occult casting inside of the game, because right now it just feels like monks don't have good options for multi-classing into occult spellcasting. If you're not multi-classing, divine occult doesn't matter, but if you're considering multi-classing, divine is probably your better option, at least as the game stands right now. But that's all I have for this video. The time has come for me to turn this conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on the monk class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Do you agree with my analysis? Or do you think there is something that I've overlooked? Is there a strength of the monk that I've ignored? Or is there a weakness of the monk that I failed to highlight? And what is your favorite combination or set of abilities to use when you play a monk? Do you agree with me that the monk feels like a video game character? And is that a good or bad design decision that Paizo made? Please jump down into the comments section and be a part of that conversation. Don't forget all the YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe. You can check out my Discord and my Patreon. Both of those are linked in the video description. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.